The fluorescent lights in the research lab buzzed softly as David Chen loosened his tie and rubbed his tired eyes. It was almost midnight, and the CEO of Apex Automotive Industries had been staring at the same engine prototype for the past 4 hours. Around him, coffee cups littered the workbenches and the whiteboard was covered with equations that led nowhere. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. When David had announced the hydrogen engine project 2 years ago, the board of directors had applauded. Investors had lined up. The media had called it revolutionary. Now that same board was threatening to pull the plug, and David couldn't blame them. They'd burned through $18 million, and the engine still had the same problem it had on day one. It overheated. Simple as that. Catastrophically, dangerously overheated. "Run it again," David said to his lead engineer, Dr. Raymond Patterson, who looked just as exhausted as he felt. Raymond shook his head slowly. "Sir, we've run this test 47 times this month. Same result every time. The coolant system just can't handle the thermal output from hydrogen combustion. The temperature spikes are too irregular, too unpredictable." David walked closer to the engine, a beautiful piece of machinery that represented everything his company stood for. Innovation, sustainability, the future of transportation, except it didn't work, not reliably, not safely, and in 3 days he had to present progress to the board, or they would shut down the entire division. 200 jobs would disappear. His reputation would be destroyed. "There has to be something we're missing," David muttered more to himself than anyone else. "Some variable we haven't considered." Raymond started packing up his equipment. "With respect, sir, we've considered everything. We've brought in consultants from MIT, Stanford, even that guy from Germany who designed the cooling systems for the European Space Agency. Everyone says the same thing. The technology is ahead of the engineering. Maybe hydrogen engines just aren't ready for commercial vehicles yet." Those words hit David like a punch. Not ready. After all this work, all this money, all these promises to his employees and stakeholders, the project might simply be impossible. "Go home, Raymond." "Get some sleep," David said quietly. "We'll try again tomorrow." As the engineers filed out, leaving behind their frustrated drawings and failed calculations, David remained alone with the engine. He'd built this company from nothing, starting in a garage 23 years ago with more ambition than sense. Now he had 700 employees, 3 manufacturing facilities, and a reputation as someone who could solve the unsolvable. But this engine was humbling him. The sound of wheels squeaking on tile broke his thoughts. David turned to see one of the night janitors entering the lab, pushing a cleaning cart stocked with spray bottles, rags, and a yellow mop bucket. The woman was probably in her mid-50s with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore the standard janitor's uniform, navy blue polo shirt with the cleaning company's logo. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, noticing David. "I didn't realize anyone was still here. I can come back later." Her accent was noticeable, but her English was clear. David had seen her around the facility before, usually working the late shift when most people had gone home. He'd never really paid attention the way most people don't really see the folks who clean up after them. "No, it's fine," David said. "I'm just leaving anyway." But he didn't leave. He stood there staring at the engine as if looking at it long enough would reveal its secrets. The janitor began her work quietly, emptying trash cans and wiping down surfaces. David appreciated that she didn't try to make small talk. He wasn't in the mood. 20 minutes passed. The janitor was cleaning the windows when David heard voices in the hallway. A younger woman appeared in the doorway, maybe 19 or 20 years old, wearing jeans and a community college hoodie with a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Mom, you almost done?" the young woman asked. "My last class ran late, but I'm ready whenever you are." "Give me 10 more minutes, Mija," the janitor replied. "Just this room and the hallway." The daughter nodded and wandered into the lab, clearly having done this routine before. She pulled out her phone, probably planning to scroll through social media while waiting, but then her eyes landed on the engine prototype. She stopped, put her phone away, moved closer. David watched as this college kid circled the engine with genuine interest, not the casual curiosity of someone killing time, but the focused attention of someone who actually understood what they were looking at. "Is this a hydrogen combustion engine?" she asked suddenly, looking at David. "It's supposed to be," David replied with more bitterness than he intended. "Right now it's more accurately described as an expensive piece of modern art." The young woman smiled slightly at that. What's wrong with it? David almost laughed. Here he was, CEO of a major automotive company, having spent 18 months with the brightest engineers money could hire, and a community college student was asking what was wrong as if she might actually be able to help. But something stopped him from dismissing her. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was desperation. Or maybe it was the way she was looking at the engine. Really looking, her eyes tracking the coolant lines, the combustion chamber housing, the sensor arrays. Overheating, David said simply. The hydrogen burns too hot too irregularly. Our cooling system can't keep up. The temperature spikes cause system failures. What kind of coolant flow pattern are you using? She asked. Now David was intrigued despite himself. Linear. Standard thermal exchange principles. Why? The young woman bit her lip, still studying the engine. Can I see the schematics? Her mother had stopped cleaning and was watching this interaction with an expression David couldn't quite read. Worry, maybe. Or something else. You want to see proprietary engine designs? David asked, but his tone wasn't harsh. It was curious. I mean, only if that's okay, the young woman said quickly. I'm just interested in how things work. I rebuild motorcycle engines with my mom. It's kind of our hobby. David made a decision that surprised even himself. He walked to the computer terminal and pulled up the cooling system schematics on the large display screen that dominated one wall of the lab. Why not? What did he have to lose? His team was out of ideas, the board was ready to pull funding, and this random student was showing more genuine interest in the problem than some of his paid consultants had. The young woman approached the screen, and her mother quietly moved closer too, though she kept pretending to wipe down a counter that was already clean. For several minutes, the student studied the display in silence. David watched her eyes move across the screen, following the coolant pathways, the valve positions, the temperature sensor locations. She zoomed in on certain sections, zoomed out to see the whole system, went back to specific details. Your coolant is flowing wrong, she finally said. David felt that familiar frustration rising again. Our coolant flow was designed by people with PhDs in thermodynamics. I'm sure it was, the young woman said, not backing down but not being rude either. But hydrogen doesn't burn like gasoline. It burns hotter in some spots and cooler in others, creating these irregular thermal pockets. Your linear coolant flow works great for regular engines where combustion is predictable, but with hydrogen, you need the coolant to move in a spiral pattern like a vortex. It needs to circulate in a way that can respond to those irregular hotspots. David stared at her, then at the screen, then back at her. A spiral pattern, he repeated slowly. Yeah. And your valve timings here? She pointed at a section of the schematic. They're probably creating microbubbles in the coolant. Those bubbles act like tiny insulators. They accumulate near the hottest areas, which makes the overheating even worse. The janitor had stopped all pretense of cleaning now. She was standing next to her daughter, looking at the screen with an intensity that matched the young woman's. David felt something he hadn't felt in months. A spark, a possibility. How do you know this? He asked quietly. The young woman glanced at her mother before answering. We've been working on converting an old car to run on hydrogen. Just as an experiment in our garage, we ran into similar problems. The engine kept overheating until we changed the coolant flow pattern. You built a hydrogen engine. In your garage, David said flatly. Well, converted one, the young woman corrected. It's not as sophisticated as this, obviously, but the basic principles are the same. David looked at the janitor, really looked at her for the first time. She met his gaze steadily, and he saw something in her eyes that made him reassess. Everything. Intelligence, knowledge, experience, things he'd completely missed because she wore a uniform and pushed a cleaning cart. Who are you two? David asked. I'm Carmen, the janitor said quietly. This is my daughter, Lisa. And you rebuild hydrogen engines as a hobby, David said, still trying to process this. We work with what we can afford, Carmen replied. The hydrogen is actually cheaper than gas once you set up the conversion. And Lisa is studying mechanical engineering at community college. I teach her what I know. What you know, David repeated. And what exactly do you know? There was a long pause. Carmen seemed to be debating something with herself. Finally, she spoke. I was a mechanical engineer back in my country. I worked on alternative fuel engine projects for 5 years before I came to America. The words hung in the air between them. You're an engineer, David said slowly. Working as a janitor. Carmen's expression didn't change. My credentials from home aren't recognized here. By the time I learned enough English and understood the system, I had a baby to feed. Cleaning jobs don't require certification battles. They just require showing up and working hard. David felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. Here he was, desperate for innovation, while an experienced engineer had been cleaning his floors for years. How many times had she walked through these labs seeing problems and solutions, staying silent because nobody asked the janitor for her opinion? He turned back to Lisa. You really think a spiral coolant flow would work? I think it would help, Lisa said carefully. But you'd also need to redesign the combustion chamber geometry slightly, and probably implement a variable pressure coolant system that can adjust in real time to thermal changes. David walked to the whiteboard and grabbed a marker. Show me. For the next 30 minutes, Lisa drew diagrams and explained her thinking. Carmen added technical details, speaking the language of engineering with the fluency of someone who'd never really left the field, just been forced out of it. Together, mother and daughter outlined an approach to the overheating problem that David's expensive consultants had never suggested. It was radical. It challenged conventional thinking, and it might actually work. When they finished, David stood back and looked at the whiteboard covered in their notes. Then he looked at Carmen in her janitor's uniform and Lisa in her community college hoodie. I have a proposal, David said. More of a challenge, really. Both women waited. You have 1 week. 7 days to prove this concept works. I'll give you access to our simulation software and testing equipment. If you can demonstrate that your spiral cooling approach solves the overheating problem, I'll fund Lisa's education at any university she wants. Full ride, any program? Lisa's eyes went wide. Carmen looked worried. And if we can't prove it? Carmen asked. Then you'll have spent a week on an interesting problem, David said with a slight smile. No harm done. He didn't say the other part out loud, that his own career was riding on finding a solution, that the board meeting in 3 days would likely end this project anyway, or that he was grasping at straws by trusting 2 people he'd just met. Lisa looked at her mother. Some silent communication passed between them. Then Lisa turned back to David. We'll do it, she said. David nodded. I'll have security set up access badges for you tomorrow. You can work in Lab 3. It's smaller, but it has everything you'll need. As he gathered his things to finally go home, David paused at the door. Carmen, he said, thank you for speaking up about your background. She nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. Walking to his car in the empty parking lot, David Chen felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not certainty. He was too experienced to be certain about anything in engineering. But hope. Real, genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, the solution to his impossible problem had been cleaning his floors all along. He just hoped it wasn't too late. Lisa couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling of the small apartment she shared with her mother, replaying the conversation in the lab over and over. Had she really just agreed to solve a problem that a team of expert engineers couldn't crack? What was she thinking? In the next room, she could hear her mother moving around. Carmen wasn't sleeping either. Around 2 in the morning, Lisa got up and found her mother sitting at their tiny kitchen table, surrounded by old notebooks. These weren't ordinary notebooks. Carmen had brought them from their home country 20 years ago, and they were filled with detailed engineering drawings, calculations, and research notes. Lisa had seen them before, but her mother rarely opened them anymore. Can't sleep either? Carmen asked without looking up. Lisa sat down across from her. Mom, are you sure about this? I mean, what if I'm wrong? What if my theory doesn't work and we just embarrass ourselves? Carmen finally looked up and there was something different in her eyes. A fire that Lisa hadn't seen in a long time. Mija, do you know how many times I walked through those labs over the past 10 years? How many times I saw engineers struggling with problems I'd solved before, but I said nothing because who would listen to the cleaning lady? Carmen's voice was quiet but intense. When you spoke up tonight, when you weren't afraid to share what you know even though you're young and still in school, I was so proud. You did something I never had the courage to do. But what if, then we fail? Carmen interrupted. We try our best, and if it doesn't work, at least we tried. But Lisa, I've spent 20 years being invisible. I'm tired of being invisible. They stayed up the rest of the night going through Carmen's old notebooks, reviewing principles of thermodynamics and hydrogen combustion. By the time the sun came up, they had filled 3 legal pads with calculations and sketches. The next morning, Lisa went to campus for her classes, but she couldn't focus. Her physics professor was talking about momentum and energy, but her mind was back in that lab, thinking about coolant flow patterns and combustion chambers. During lunch, instead of hanging out with her friends, she went to the library and checked out every book they had on hydrogen fuel systems. Her friend Tyler noticed. "You okay? You've been weird all day." "Just have a project I'm working on," Lisa said vaguely. "For which class?" "It's complicated." She didn't know how to explain that she'd somehow gotten involved in trying to save a multi-million-dollar corporate research project. Tyler would think she was making it up. That afternoon, Lisa's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Your access badges are ready. Security desk, main entrance." David Chen. Lisa stared at the message. This was really happening. She picked up her mother from work early, and they drove to Apex Automotive together. At the security desk, they found 2 temporary badges waiting for them with their names and photos that must have been pulled from the building's visitor log. The badges had consultant printed across the top. The security guard, an older man named Frank, who usually just nodded at Carmen when she came in for her night shift, did a double take. "Carmen, what's going on? You're coming in during the day now?" "Special project," Carmen said, trying to keep her voice steady. Frank handed over the badges, looking confused but not asking more questions. As they walked through the corridors toward Lab 3, several employees did double takes when they saw Carmen. The night janitor, walking through during business hours, not pushing a cleaning cart, wearing regular clothes instead of her uniform. Some people looked away quickly, embarrassed. Others whispered to their colleagues. Lisa felt a surge of anger on her mother's behalf. These people had no idea who Carmen really was. Lab 3 was smaller than the main research facility, but it had everything they needed. Computer terminals with simulation software, testing equipment, tools, and most importantly, access to all the technical specifications for the hydrogen engine project. David had left them a note. "Everything you need should be here. If you run into access problems with any files or equipment, call me directly." His personal cell number was written at the bottom. For the first hour, Lisa and Carmen just studied. They pulled up every test result from the past 18 months, every failed solution, every consultant's report. The amount of work that had gone into this project was staggering. Hundreds of brilliant people had tackled this problem from every conceivable angle. "Look at this," Carmen said, pointing at a report from 6 months ago. This team from MIT recommended adjusting the coolant mixture. They were thinking in the right direction, but they didn't go far enough. They kept treating it like a traditional engine problem. "Because that's how they were trained," Lisa said, understanding dawning. "All their education, all their experience, it's based on gasoline engines. They're trying to apply old rules to new technology." "Exactly. We need to think different. Hydrogen isn't just a different fuel. It's a completely different animal." They started building their model in the simulation software. Lisa handled most of the computer work, while Carmen guided her through the engineering principles. It was slow going. The software was sophisticated, meant for professional engineers, and Lisa had to figure out how to use it as she went. By the end of the first day, they had a rough digital model of their spiral cooling system, but when they ran the first simulation, it failed spectacularly. The temperature spikes were actually worse than the original design. "No, no, no," Lisa said, staring at the red warning messages flashing across the screen. "This was supposed to work. The theory is sound." Carmen studied the results carefully. "The theory is sound. But look here, the coolant entry points are wrong. We need to stagger them. Create multiple vortex points instead of one large spiral." They adjusted the design and ran it again. Better, but still not good enough. The engine would still overheat, just slightly less catastrophically. "Maybe we're wrong," Lisa said, her confidence wavering. "Maybe the experts were right and this just can't be done. Or maybe we need to think even more differently," Carmen replied. She pulled out one of her old notebooks, flipping through pages until she found what she was looking for. "When I was working on engine projects back home, we had a saying, 'Nature always knows best.' Look at how water moves in a river, how air flows in a tornado, how blood circulates through the body. Natural systems handle irregular patterns all the time, so we need to make the coolant flow more.
Natural?
Lisa asked. Not just natural, adaptive. What if the spiral pattern changed based on where the hot spots were appearing? Lisa's eyes widened. A dynamic cooling system. The flow pattern adjusts in real time based on sensor feedback. They worked through dinner, ordering pizza that arrived cold because they forgot about it for 2 hours. They worked past midnight refining the model, adding complexity, then stripping it back when it got too complicated. This was the part of engineering that nobody talked about, the tedious, frustrating process of iteration, of trying and failing and trying again. On the second day, they started building a physical prototype. Not of the full engine, but of the cooling system alone. They could test whether their spiral design actually worked using a smaller, simpler setup. This meant trips to hardware stores, ordering specialized parts online with rush delivery, and a lot of improvisation. Carmen showed skills that amazed Lisa. She could look at a pile of random parts and see how they could fit together. She could hold tolerances in her head, calculate angles by eye, and work with a precision that came from decades of experience. "Where did you learn to do that?" Lisa asked, watching her mother drill perfectly aligned holes without even measuring twice. "Your grandfather taught me," Carmen said with a small smile. "He was a mechanic. Back then, being an engineer meant you could also work with your hands. You didn't just design things on a computer. You built them, tested them, fixed them when they broke." By the afternoon of the third day, they had a working prototype of their cooling system. It was rough, cobbled together from parts that weren't really meant to go together, but it functioned. Now they needed to test it. That's when Dr. Raymond Patterson showed up. The lead engineer walked into Lab 3 without knocking, followed by 2 other members of the research team. Lisa recognized them from that first night. They'd been packing up when David had challenged her. "So this is where the magic is supposed to happen," Raymond said, his tone dripping with skepticism. He looked at their makeshift prototype with barely concealed disdain. "David actually gave you lab access for this?" Carmen straightened up from the workbench, and Lisa noticed her mother's hands were steady, even though she must have been nervous. Years of being dismissed had taught Carmen how to hide her feelings. "We're testing a new cooling system design," Lisa said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I can see that," Raymond said, circling their prototype like a shark. "Though I'm not sure I'd call this a design so much as—" "What would you call this, Jennifer? A science fair project?" One of the other engineers, a young woman named Jennifer, looked uncomfortable but said nothing. "The spiral cooling concept is actually interesting," the third engineer, an older man whose badge said Peter, offered. He seemed genuinely curious rather than dismissive. "Mind explaining how it's supposed to work?" Lisa walked them through the design, explaining the theory of adaptive vortex cooling and how it could respond to the irregular thermal patterns of hydrogen combustion. She tried to use the right technical terms, tried to sound like she belonged in this lab, but she could feel Raymond's skepticism growing with every word. "This is what we're betting on?" Raymond said when she finished. "David's solution to 18 months of research as a community college student and—" He glanced at Carmen. "Her mother? No offense, but this is absurd." "Then why are you here?" Carmen asked quietly. Raymond turned to her and Lisa saw something flash across his face. Surprise maybe that the janitor had spoken. "I'm here because I care about this project," Raymond said. "I've put 2 years of my life into that engine. I've worked 80-hour weeks, missed my kids' birthday parties, sacrificed my health. And now David's acting like maybe we just weren't smart enough. Like the solution was so simple that anyone could have figured it out if we'd just thought differently." For the first time, Lisa understood. Raymond wasn't just being mean. He was hurt, threatened. His expertise, his identity as an engineer, his self-worth, all of it was tied up in this project. And here they were, outsiders, suggesting that maybe his approach had been wrong all along. "No one thinks you're not smart enough," Carmen said, and her voice was gentle now. "You're brilliant. Anyone can see that from your work. But sometimes being too close to a problem makes it harder to see new solutions. You've been thinking about this engine every day for 2 years. Lisa and I were coming in fresh. That's our only advantage." Raymond stared at Carmen for a long moment. Then he looked at their prototype again. "Fine," he said. "Show me, run your test. Let's see if this brilliant fresh perspective actually works." There was a challenge in his voice, but also something else. A tiny spark of hope, maybe. Because despite his skepticism and wounded pride, Raymond wanted a solution. He wanted the engine to work. That desire was stronger than his ego. Lisa and Carmen exchanged glances. They'd planned to run preliminary tests first, to work out the kinks in private. But now they had an audience, and that audience included the lead engineer, who would have significant influence over whether their ideas were taken seriously. "Okay," Lisa said, her heart pounding. "Let's run the test." They powered up their prototype, connected the sensors, and started the simulation that would pump heated fluid through the system to mimic the thermal conditions of hydrogen combustion. On the computer screen, temperature readings began to appear in real time. The four of them, Lisa, Carmen, Raymond, Jennifer, and Peter, stood watching the numbers climb. In a traditional linear cooling system, the temperature would spike quickly and unevenly. That's what had been happening with the original engine design. But with their spiral system, something different happened. The temperature rose, yes, but it rose evenly. The coolant circulated in a vortex pattern, distributing heat more efficiently. When the simulation introduced an irregular hotspot, mimicking the unpredictable nature of hydrogen combustion, the system responded. The flow pattern adjusted slightly automatically, pulling heat away from the hotspot. The temperature held steady. Not cold, but controlled. Manageable, exactly what they needed. "It's working," Jennifer whispered. They ran the test for 30 minutes, throwing different variables at the system. Each time, the adaptive spiral cooling responded appropriately. Not perfectly. This was still just a prototype, but well enough to prove the concept was sound. When they finally shut down the test, Raymond stood there staring at the screen, his expression unreadable. "This is preliminary," he finally said. "It proves the concept might work on a small scale. But scaling this up to a full engine is a completely different challenge." "The engineering complexity alone is significant," Carmen interrupted. "We know this isn't a complete solution. It's a proof of concept, but it's more progress than anyone's made in 6 months." Raymond looked at her, really looked at her, and Lisa saw the moment when he stopped seeing the janitor and started seeing the engineer. "Who are you really?" he asked Carmen. "Someone who understands what it's like to have everything to prove," Carmen replied. Peter, who had been quiet this whole time, spoke up. "We should tell David. He needs to see this before the board meeting tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Lisa's stomach dropped. "The board meeting is tomorrow? I thought we had a week." Raymond's expression softened slightly. "David didn't tell you? The board's been pushing for an earlier meeting. They want to shut down the project and cut their losses. David got them to agree to one final presentation tomorrow afternoon. If he can't show significant progress, they're pulling the plug." Lisa looked at her mother. 3 days. They'd had 3 days, not 7, and they'd just barely proven their concept worked on a tiny prototype. There was no way they could build and test a full-scale system by tomorrow. Carmen's jaw set in that determined way Lisa knew well. The same look she'd had when they first arrived in America with nothing. The same look she'd had working double shifts to keep their apartment. The same look she'd had every time life told her she couldn't do something. "Then we better get back to work," Carmen said. "We have a lot to do before tomorrow afternoon." Raymond surprised them both by nodding. "We'll help," he said. Then looking at Jennifer and Peter, "Won't we?" Jennifer smiled. "I'll order more pizza. The kind that we'll actually remember to eat this time." Peter was already rolling up his sleeves. "Let's see those calculations again. If we're going to present this tomorrow, we need to make sure every number is bulletproof." As they gathered around the workbench, Lisa felt something shift. They weren't outsiders anymore, fighting alone. They had allies now. People who understood what was at stake and who were willing to take a chance on a radical new approach. It was going to be a very long night. But for the first time since this whole thing started, Lisa thought they might actually have a shot at pulling this off. The conference room on the top floor of Apex Automotive had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Normally, Lisa would have been amazed by the view. But right now, all she could focus on was the 15 people sitting around the massive table, watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright skepticism. The board of directors had arrived at 2 o'clock sharp. Men and women in expensive suits carrying tablets and leather folders, their faces showing the weariness of people who'd heard too many failed promises. They'd flown in from different cities specifically for this meeting. and their body language made it clear they expected to shut down the hydrogen engine project today. David stood at the head of the table, and Lisa could see the tension in his shoulders. He'd barely slept in the past 3 days. None of them had. "Thank you all for coming," David began. "I know you've heard a lot of excuses over the past 18 months about why this engine isn't working. Today is different. Today we have a real breakthrough. A woman in her 60s, whose nameplate read Margaret Sinclair, board chair, leaned back in her chair. "David, we've heard about breakthroughs before. We've invested $18 million in breakthroughs. What makes today different? Because this time the solution came from somewhere we weren't looking," David said. He gestured to the back of the room where Lisa, Carmen, Raymond, Jennifer, and Peter stood. "I'd like to introduce you to the team that solved our overheating problem." Margaret's eyes swept over them, lingering on Lisa and Carmen. Lisa suddenly felt very aware of her jeans and university sweatshirt, so out of place among all these business suits. Next to her, her mother stood perfectly still, but Lisa could see Carmen's hands clasped tightly together. "That's your breakthrough team?" asked a man whose nameplate identified him as Robert Chen, CFO. He didn't even try to hide his doubt. "David, what are you doing?" "I'm presenting you with a solution that works," David said firmly. "Lisa, why don't you walk them through what you've discovered?" Lisa's mouth went dry. Public speaking had never been her favorite thing, and that was in front of college classmates, not corporate board members who controlled millions of dollars. But she'd practiced this presentation a dozen times last night. She knew this material inside and out. She stepped forward and Jennifer handed her the remote for the display screen. Lisa pulled up the first slide, a simple diagram of the spiral cooling system. For the past 18 months, everyone's been treating the hydrogen engine like it's just a modified gasoline engine, Lisa began, and was relieved that her voice came out steady. But hydrogen combustion creates irregular thermal patterns that traditional cooling systems can't handle. The heat doesn't distribute evenly. It creates pockets and spikes that are unpredictable. She clicked to the next slide, showing temperature maps from the failed tests. Bright red spots indicated dangerous overheating. Every solution tried so far has been based on linear cooling flow, coolant moving in straight lines through the engine. That works fine for traditional engines where combustion is predictable, but with hydrogen you need something different. Margaret leaned forward slightly. At least she was paying attention now. "We developed an adaptive spiral cooling system," Lisa continued. "Instead of moving in straight lines, the coolant flows in a vortex pattern. Think of it like a tornado or water going down a drain. This spiral movement naturally adjusts to irregular heat patterns. When a hot spot appears, the vortex pulls coolant toward it automatically." She showed them the simulation results, the before and after temperature readings. The difference was dramatic. Bright red danger zones turned to manageable yellows and greens. "But here's the key innovation," Lisa said, feeling more confident now. "The system is adaptive. It uses real-time sensor data to adjust the coolant pressure and flow rate. When the engine needs more cooling in one area, the system responds instantly. It's not just passive cooling. It's active, intelligent cooling." Robert, the CFO, held up a hand. "These are simulations. Computer models. We've seen promising computer models before that failed in real-world testing. Which is why we built a working prototype." Raymond stepped forward, and Lisa felt grateful for his support. "Over the past 3 days, we've run extensive physical tests. Not on a computer, but on actual hardware." He nodded to Peter, who wheeled in their prototype on a cart. It looked rough. Exposed wiring, mismatched parts, everything held together with determination and very little sleep. But it worked. "This is obviously not pretty," Raymond admitted. "But it functions. We've subjected it to the same thermal stress that's been destroying our engine designs. Not only did it handle the load, it maintained temperature stability for over 6 hours of continuous operation." Margaret stood up and walked over to examine the prototype more closely. She traced one of the coolant lines with her finger, studying how the spiral system connected. "Who designed this?" she asked. There was a pause. Lisa glanced at her mother. "We both did," Carmen said quietly. "My daughter and I." Margaret turned to look at Carmen directly. "And you are?" "Carmen Rodriguez. I work here at Apex. In what capacity?" Another pause. Lisa saw her mother's jaw tighten slightly. "I'm on the night cleaning staff," Carmen said, meeting Margaret's gaze without flinching. "But I'm also a mechanical engineer. I was trained and worked professionally for 5 years before I came to America. You could have heard a pin drop in that conference room. Several board members exchanged glances. Robert actually laughed, though it wasn't a kind sound. "So let me understand this correctly," Robert said. "David, you're basing our $18 million project on work from a janitor and a community college student?" "I'm basing it on work from two talented engineers who approached an old problem with fresh thinking," David replied, and there was an edge to his voice now. "Their credentials are irrelevant. Their results speak for themselves." "Credentials are absolutely relevant," Margaret said, but her tone was thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Carmen, why aren't your professional qualifications recognized here?" Carmen took a breath. "The political situation in my home country made it dangerous to stay. When I came to America, I had to start over. The process to have foreign credentials evaluated and recognized is expensive and time-consuming. I had a baby to feed and rent to pay. I took the work I could get." "And you've been cleaning our offices for how long?" 10 years, Margaret looked at David. 10 years. She's been walking through our facilities for 10 years and nobody thought to ask if she had skills we could use. "To be fair," Carmen said, and Lisa heard something new in her mother's voice. Something stronger, less apologetic. "Nobody looks at the cleaning staff as people who might have something to offer beyond emptying trash cans." The room got very quiet. Some of the board members looked uncomfortable. Others looked thoughtful. Robert still looked skeptical. "This is a lovely story," Robert finally said. "Very inspiring. But we're not running a charity here. We need solutions that can scale, that can be manufactured, that can meet safety standards and regulations. Even if this prototype works, and I'm not convinced it does, can you actually implement it in a production engine?" "Yes," Carmen said simply. "You sound very confident for someone who's been out of engineering for 20 years, Robert shot back. "I haven't been out of engineering," Carmen replied. "I've been doing it in my garage instead of an office. The principles don't change just because you're working with used parts instead of unlimited budgets." Peter spoke up. "I've reviewed their calculations. The math is solid. More than solid, it's innovative. And I've been doing this for 30 years, so I know what I'm looking at." Jennifer added, "The beauty of their design is its simplicity. Yes, it'll need refinement for production, but the core concept is sound and scalable. I'd stake my reputation on it." Raymond, who had been their biggest skeptic just days ago, nodded. "When I first saw their work, I thought it was too simple. Too elegant. We've been overcomplicating this problem, adding layers of complex solutions when what we needed was to rethink the fundamental approach. They did that." Margaret returned to her seat, but Lisa noticed she didn't sit down. She stood behind her chair, hands resting on the leather back, thinking. "David, you've put your credibility on the line here," Margaret said. "If we approve moving forward with this design and it fails, that's not just 18 million down the drain. That's your leadership called into question." "I understand," David said. "And if it succeeds, then we have a viable hydrogen engine that could revolutionize the automotive industry." Margaret looked at the other board members. Lisa tried to read their expressions but couldn't. Some seemed intrigued. Others still looked doubtful. A few were whispering to each other. "I want to see it run," Margaret said suddenly. "Not the prototype. The actual engine. Can you install this cooling system in your hydrogen engine?" Raymond and David exchanged glances. "That would take time," Raymond said carefully. "At least 2 weeks to properly integrate." "You have 3 days," Margaret interrupted. "We'll reconvene on Friday. If this cooling system performs as promised on the actual engine, we'll approve continued funding for the project. If it doesn't, we shut it down permanently." 3 days isn't enough time," Raymond started.
3 days is what you have, Margaret said firmly.
"David, you're asking us to trust your judgment. I'm asking you to prove it's worthy of trust. 3 days." She gathered her things and the other board members followed her lead. Within minutes, the conference room had cleared, leaving just the team standing there in stunned silence. 3 days, Jennifer said quietly. "That's impossible. The integration alone will take—" "Then we work around the clock," David interrupted. "We bring in anyone who can help. We do whatever it takes." Lisa felt her mother's hand on her shoulder. "David," Carmen said, "can I speak with you privately for a moment?" David nodded and they stepped out into the hallway. Through the glass walls, Lisa could see them talking, though she couldn't hear the words. Her mother was animated, gesturing as she spoke. David listened, then nodded, then pulled out his phone and made a call. When they came back in, David's expression had changed. There was a new determination there, I just called facilities management, he said. Carmen's being transferred to the engineering department effective immediately. Full-time position with a salary appropriate to her expertise. We'll work on getting her credentials properly recognized, but that doesn't matter right now. Right now, we need her on this team officially. Carmen's eyes widened. Lisa saw her mother's hand go to her mouth, and for a second she thought Carmen might cry. But she didn't. She just nodded, unable to speak. As for Lisa, David continued, you're being hired as a junior engineer, part-time, so you can continue your classes. This isn't charity. This is us recognizing talent where we find it. I'm still in school, Lisa managed to say. I haven't even finished my associate's degree yet. Neither had Bill Gates when he started Microsoft, David said with a slight smile. You'll finish your degree. We'll make sure of that. But you're also going to help us build this engine. Raymond stepped forward. Okay, if we're doing this, we need to get organized. 3 days means we're basically pulling 2 all-nighters with a short break in between. We'll need the machine shop, the full integration team, and access to the main engine prototype. I'll handle the logistics, David said. You focus on the engineering. We should also bring in Kevin from quality control, Peter suggested. If this is going to face board scrutiny, every measurement needs to be documented perfectly. And Hannah from safety, Jennifer added. We can't afford any accidents or protocol violations. Plans started coming together quickly. People pulled out phones, sending messages, making calls. The team was forming, expanding beyond just the 5 of them. Lisa found herself standing next to her mother as everyone moved around them with purpose. Mom, she whispered. Did we really just get hired? Like actual jobs? Carmen looked at her daughter and there were tears in her eyes now, but she was smiling. Yes, mija. Actual jobs. Doing what we were meant to do. I'm scared, Lisa admitted. What if it doesn't work? What if we fail? Then we fail while doing something important, Carmen said. But I don't think we're going to fail. We have 3 days to do the impossible. And you know what? I've done impossible things before. I came to a new country with a baby and no money. I learned a new language. I kept us fed and housed while working jobs that people don't even notice. Building an engine? That's easy compared to what we've already survived. Lisa laughed, even though she was also close to crying. Her mother was right. They'd faced harder things than this. Besides, Carmen added with a mischievous smile, we have something those board members don't have. What's that? We have nothing to lose and everything to prove. That's the most powerful motivation in the world. Raymond called them over to the whiteboard where he was sketching out a timeline. Okay, we need to break this into phases. First 6 hours, we disassemble the cooling system on the current engine. Next 12 hours, we fabricate the new spiral components. Then we've got 18 hours for installation and testing. That leaves us 12 hours for troubleshooting before the board comes back. That's 48 hours exactly, Peter pointed out. No room for error. Then we don't make errors, Raymond said simply. David looked around at the team, engineers who'd been working on this problem for months, now joined by a former janitor and her community college student daughter. I won't lie to you, he said. This is a gamble. If we fail, a lot of people lose their jobs, including me. The hydrogen program gets scrapped. All that work, all that potential gone. But if we succeed, we change everything. Not just for this company, but for the entire industry. Maybe even for the planet. He paused, making eye contact with each of them. So let's get to work. We have an impossible deadline to meet, and I can't think of a better team to meet it with. As they headed down to the main research facility, Lisa felt the weight of what they were about to attempt. 3 days to install an unproven cooling system in a multi-million-dollar engine. 3 days to prove that sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places. 3 days to show that talent and innovation don't require fancy degrees or corner offices. Sometimes they just need someone willing to take a chance. Lisa looked at her mother, walking alongside these professional engineers like she'd always belonged there. Because she had. She'd always belonged there. It had just taken the right person and the right crisis to see it. Now they had to prove it wasn't a mistake to believe in them. The main research facility looked like a war room by hour 12. Empty energy drink cans lined the workbenches. Pizza boxes were stacked in the corner. The whiteboard was covered in calculations, crossed out and rewritten so many times that some sections were barely readable. And in the center of it all sat the hydrogen engine, partially disassembled, looking like a patient in the middle of heart surgery. Lisa's eyes burned from staring at computer screens and tiny engine components. Her back ached from hunching over the workbench. She'd been awake for almost 30 hours straight, surviving on coffee and determination. Around her, the team moved like a well-choreographed dance, each person knowing exactly what needed to happen next. Carmen was elbow-deep in the engine, carefully removing the old coolant lines. Her hands were steady despite the exhaustion. Years of working night shifts had trained her body to push through tiredness. Raymond worked beside her, and Lisa noticed how their dynamic had changed. He listened when Carmen spoke now, asked her opinion, treated her like the engineer she'd always been. "We've got a problem," Jennifer called out from her computer terminal. "The spiral manifold we designed doesn't fit the existing mounting points. The bolt patterns are off by 3 millimeters. 3 millimeters? Such a tiny measurement, but in precision engineering it might as well be a mile. Can we drill new mounting holes?" Peter asked. "Not without compromising the structural integrity of the housing," Jennifer replied, frustration clear in her voice. Carmen pulled herself out of the engine and walked over to look at the CAD design on Jennifer's screen. She studied it for a moment, then grabbed a pencil and started sketching on a notepad. "What if we don't mount it to the housing at all?" Carmen said. "What if we create a floating mount system? Let the manifold sit in a bracket that can adjust for minor variations. It adds flexibility, which might actually help with thermal expansion anyway." Raymond looked over her shoulder at the sketch. "That could work. But we'd need to fabricate custom brackets, and the machine shop is already backed up with the other components we need." "I can make them," Carmen said simply. "You can run a CNC machine?" Jennifer asked, surprised. "I can run a manual mill," Carmen replied. "Old school, but it'll get the job done. And probably faster than waiting for CNC time." She headed toward the machine shop, and Lisa followed her. She'd watched her mother work with tools their whole life, but never in a professional setting like this. Carmen approached the manual milling machine with the confidence of someone returning to an old friend. "Can you really make those brackets by hand?" Lisa asked as her mother began setting up the machine. "Your grandfather taught me on machines older than this one," Carmen said, measuring and marking a piece of aluminum stock. "CNC is faster, sure, but sometimes the old ways are more reliable." She started the mill, and the sound of metal cutting filled the shop. Lisa watched as her mother worked, making precise adjustments, measuring twice, cutting once. Each movement was deliberate, practiced. This wasn't someone who'd been away from engineering. This was someone who'd been doing it all along, just without the recognition. "Mom," Lisa said over the sound of the machine, "why didn't you ever push harder to get your credentials recognized? You could have been doing this the whole time." Carmen didn't stop working, but Lisa saw her jaw tighten slightly. "You think I didn't try?" Carmen said. "The first year we were here, I spent every spare moment filling out forms, getting documents translated, contacting credential evaluation services. Do you know how much it costs to get foreign engineering credentials officially recognized? Thousands of dollars, money we didn't have because we were barely affording rent and groceries." She paused to check her measurement, then continued cutting. "And even if I'd had the money, the process takes years. Meanwhile, I had a baby who needed food, medicine, clothes, so I made a choice. I took the work I could get immediately, and I told myself it was temporary, that I'd go back to engineering once we were